Welcome to The Silent Empires. Tonight, step into the world of Joe Adonis, the polished gangster, whose charm and style made him as famous as his power in the underworld. A close ally of Lucky Luciano, Adonis was more than just muscle. He was a man who mixed elegance with danger, building his reputation in both the spotlight and the shadows. As you close your eyes, picture the smoky clubs, the whispered deals, and the empire he helped shape in New York's hidden corners. Before we begin, share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. And if you love sleeping stories of gangsters and forgotten empires, don't forget to subscribe and join our family. Now, relax, and let the silence guide you into the night. Giuseppe Antonio Dotto entered the world at the turn of the 20th century in southern Italy, part of a wave of families who would pack hopes into trunks and stake their futures on New York. He reached Brooklyn as a child, joining crowded tenements and street corners where accents mingled and ambitions sharpened fast. The Lower East Side and nearby Brooklyn blocks turned boys into hustlers and hustlers into specialists. Dodo learned quickly that softness got you pushed off the curb. He watched older kids collect pennies running errands for gamblers, saw men slip envelopes to beat cops, and saw factories empty at dusk onto avenues where numbers writers took bets as easily as grocers took coins. In that classroom, he discovered two talents: a steel nerve and a knack for presentation. He kept himself immaculate. Friends joked he preened like the mythic Adonis, and the name stuck first at pool halls, then in police files. By his late teens, Joe Adonis had drifted into the orbit of other neighborhood strivers who hated the old guard's heavy-handed rules. Charles Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel were forming a new kind of crew, less tribal, more businesslike. They didn't abandon violence, but they preferred predictable profits over chaotic vendettas. Adonis fit that vision. He helped convert street smarts into rackets that moved with the times. Prohibition, which began in 1920, turned New York into a thirsty factory of opportunity. The Young Alliance saw liquor as a supply chain problem, not a moral one. Adonis became a dependable earner, smoothing routes, keeping distributors reliable, arranging storage, and tying relationships together across Brooklyn, Manhattan, and New Jersey. Early records connect him with auto theft rings and bootlegging convoys, crimes that paid well if managed carefully. Cars disappeared, got retagged, and supported delivery lines. Trucks carrying cases of whiskey rolled out of Jersey depots, through the Holland or Lincoln tunnels, and into city nightlife. Bars that looked legitimate kept back rooms and passwords. Private clubs demanded the right handshake. Adonis specialized in making those handshakes count. He developed a reputation for consistency, honoring agreements and keeping hotheads in check. That polished demeanor helped him reach into Manhattan showplaces where money moved in tuxedos and judges liked a good dinner as much as the next man. He learned the etiquette of envelopes, who got them, and how regularly. It wasn't just bribery, it was schedule. Prohibition also brought competition. Older bosses like Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masseria prized muscle and demanded tribute. Many first-generation crews answered to him, including Luciano's. But resentment brewed. The old guard had ways that smothered initiative and invited needless bloodshed. Adonis and his circle felt squeezed. Across the river, Salvatore Maranzano gathered another faction with similar appetites for control. The rivalry exploded into the Castellamarese War, 1930-1931, a series of targeted strikes that rattled the city. Adonis stood with Luciano's forward-looking bloc. They weren't idealists. They were pragmatists who wanted the fighting to stop so business could stabilize. Accounts differ on every triggerman and setup in that period, but contemporary reporting and later testimony consistently place Adonis near the center of the factional maneuvers. His role was not the loudest, yet he helped coordinate meetings, secure safe locations, and keep allies aligned. The war ended when Luciano outmaneuvered both Masseria and, soon after, Maranzano. Stories have circulated for decades that Adonis played a part in the ambush of Masseria at a Coney Island restaurant, with names like Siegel, Genovese, and Anastasia often cited in the same breath. The truth remains wrapped in conflicting memories, but historians agree that the Luciano camp, which included Adonis, took responsibility for removing obstacles and reorganizing the underworld. The outcome mattered more than any single shot. Luciano dismantled the old hierarchy and created a governing council, the Commission to Regulate Disputes. That structural change set the template for modern organized crime in America. Adonis wasn't a family boss. He didn't need to be. As a close ally of Luciano and later Frank Costello, he enjoyed influence that crossed borough lines. He focused on what he knew best: gambling, nightclubs, unions that touched nightlife, and the lubricating payments that kept them humming. With Prohibition closing in 1933, Adonis pivoted. He expanded gambling bookmaking on horse races and sports, numbers in some neighborhoods, and later slot machines in spots that tolerated them. He invested in restaurants and lounges, where showgirls mingled with brokers and actors, shared tables with ward healers. The manpower came from a network spanning Brooklyn, Midtown, and North Jersey. In New Jersey, he worked closely with Willie Moretti and maintained ties to Abner Longhi's Wilman, extending reach into Bergen and Essex counties. Police and prosecutors on both sides of the Hudson accused them of running betting parlors, protecting dice games, and taxing independent operations. The testimony in those years depicted Adonis as a sponsor who rarely appeared at a scene yet took a cut because he provided the umbrella, security, lawyers, and mediators. That low profile kept him safer than flashier peers. Adonis also cultivated friendships in politics. The New Deal era changed local machines but didn't erase them. Tammany Hall still influenced appointments and contracts. And in New Jersey, county bosses held real power. Adonis understood that a ward leader could stop a raid or set one in motion. He became known for impeccable manners with officials and patience with reporters who caught him leaving restaurants with well-placed friends. He never bragged. He had a habit of smiling courteously and saying very little, a tactic that enraged ambitious prosecutors who wanted sound bites. Within his circle, the rule was obvious: stay neat, stay calm, and when heat rises, step back and let subordinates absorb it. That approach didn't eliminate risk. It only postponed it. The mid-1930 seconds brought new pressures. Dutch Schultz attempted to dominate policy betting in Harlem and demanded permission to target Thomas Dewey, the special prosecutor raking through rackets. The Luciano Commission bloc refused the idea of killing a crusading attorney, calculating that such an act would trigger a reaction they couldn't contain. Schultz was removed by hitmen loyal to commission policy. Again, rumors swirled about who passed messages and who posted lookouts. Adonis's fingerprint on that moment was influence, not spectacle. He backed the modern rules: centralized decisions, measured force, and protection of profitable markets. Soon after, Dewey's focus shifted to a broad crackdown on vice, including the prostitution case that sent Luciano to prison in 1936. Allies tried many ways to blunt the campaign: legal teams, appeals, and pressure on witnesses. Whispers of jury tampering circled the courthouse, though firm proof against Adonis never materialized. What is clear is that when Luciano was convicted and later deported, Frank Costello became the face of the family's day-to-day business, and Adonis served as a crucial pillar of that regime. During the late 1930 seconds, Adonis tightened his hold on gambling in Midtown and in New Jersey suburbs. Authorities raided rooms that hid behind cigar counters and barbershops. They seized betting slips and arrested clerks who rarely knew the top of the pyramid. His name rarely appeared on a lease. He avoided telephones when possible and favored intermediaries. He kept ownerships layered through relatives and trusted fronts. He put money into legitimate ventures: laundries, restaurants, vending concerns to explain income and provide hiring screens. When police testimony sketched the organization, they painted Adonis as a coordinator who controlled entry and exit points to profit streams. Gamblers who operated without permission found their suppliers cut off, their landlords nervous, or their bankers uncooperative. It was pressure without spectacle, which fit his brand. World War II added another twist. New York's waterfront mattered more than ever, and rumors long have tied Luciano's circle to arrangements with naval intelligence that reduced sabotage risks on the docks. Adonis, linked to Costello and longtime allies with reach on the piers, benefited from the calmer climate. The details of those wartime contacts remain debated, but what's indisputable is that Adonis came out of the war years with his standing intact and his businesses steady. He still took care with appearances: tailored suits, manicured hair, a controlled smile. Prosecutors depicted that polish as camouflage for bookmaking lines stretching from Times Square to Newark. His attorneys called him a legitimate entrepreneur with a taste for nightlife. Judges heard both versions a lot in those days. Respect within the network didn't mean unlimited peace. Internal rivalries churned quietly. Vito Genovese, back from a period in Italy, nursed ambitions, while Costello maintained a political, almost pastoral style of leadership. Adonis leaned toward Costello, preferring the stability that came with favors and calendars instead of ambushes and war councils. He remained a counselor who could broker peace or coordinate a push into new territory. Enforcement existed, but he preferred to let men like Albert Anastasia, who ran fearsome crews, handle it at arm's length. Investigators later argued that such distance shielded him from direct exposure when violence followed decisions. They weren't wrong. Surviving police logs show few moments where his presence coincided with action. That scarcity was strategic. By the late 1942, his name had grown too familiar to ignore. Newspaper columnists wrote about Handsome Joe, sometimes with a smirk, sometimes in alarm. The national spotlight brightened when the Kefauver Committee began hauling suspected racketeers before television cameras in 1950, 1951. Adonis's world depended on discretion. This was the opposite. Senators asked about gambling routes, political contributions, and union influence. Adonis invoked his rights frequently, refusing to incriminate himself. That posture irritated the committee and emboldened local prosecutors in New York and New Jersey. Indictments followed on gambling and related offenses. He was accused of running bookmaking syndicates, profiting from slot machines where they were prohibited, and lying to investigators about income and associations. In some cases, he fought the charges. In others, he entered pleas that minimized exposure. He did time in state custody linked to gambling cases. A rare concession that showed even careful men could be cornered when the wind shifted. His troubles didn't end with sentences. Immigration authorities examined his status. He had never naturalized, and the government moved to remove him as an undesirable alien with a criminal record. After years of hearings and appeals, he chose a path that softened the blow in legal terms, but ended his American career. He agreed to leave the United States and was placed under orders that prevented his return. The decision came after a life spent cultivating power in Manhattan dining rooms and Jersey backrooms, an exit made by a man who always prized control over spectacle. He sailed for Italy in the mid-1950s, leaving behind a family, a fortune mostly hidden in layered investments, and a legend polished by reporters who couldn't resist his nickname. Even in exile, the outline of his American years remained visible. The transformation from a Brooklyn kid into a pivotal ally of Luciano and Costello, the ascent through Prohibition and the post-Prohibition gambling boom, the careful ties to politicians and union figures, the role in a restructured national underworld, the power maintained by finesse more than volume, and the legal avalanche that finally pushed him out. He had built a reputation on steadiness and style, and he carried both into the last chapter of his life across the Atlantic, far from the Broadway lights that had once flashed over his name in every gossip column and inquiry transcript. He learned early that the best lever in New York was not a cudgel, but the calendar. If the right sergeant got his envelope on Wednesday, the dice in the back room would keep rolling on Thursday. When Mayor LaGuardia staged his public crusade against slot machines, photographers snapping while crews smashed cabinets and carted the wreckage to the river, Adonis didn't rant. He rerouted. Machines drifted across the Hudson into New Jersey diners, candy stores, and taverns that welcomed the extra pennies. A neat man with a soft voice could do very well in a landscape like that. He kept the ownerships layered behind vending firms and silent partners. The machines themselves sat behind counters as if they had always lived there. To customers, they were amusements. To Adonis, they were a steady river. North Jersey became a second home base through old friendships that had matured into partnerships. Willie Moretti, brash where Adonis was composed, helped knit together territory in Bergen and Passaic counties, with lines traced between neighborhoods so small operators understood where not to wander. Longie's Willman, Newark's dominant figure, had his own sphere. The three men found an equilibrium that turned competition into negotiated order. Police raids produced headlines, but they didn't erase the structure. The bookmaking rooms regrouped, the slot distributors relabeled shipments, and the barber chairs kept turning while back offices took wagers by telephone. Adonis's value was never the loudest voice. It was the assurance that if you played by the posted rules percentage, punctuality, and discretion, your place would be safe tomorrow. In Manhattan, his profile sat just to the side of show lights. He took tables at midtown restaurants, where maitre d's knew his favorite booth, and the waiter refilled a glass without being asked. People noticed how he dressed, how he listened, how he declined to raise his tone. That calm helped him during the years when Luciano's imprisonment and deportation reshuffled the board. Frank Costello stepped to the fore with a political style that made judges, bail bondsmen, and club owners feel useful rather than frightened. Adonis flourished in that climate. He put money into night spots and service businesses that touched night spots' linen supply, vending, small trucking tied to clubs, while keeping the real profit in the gambling that ran through those rooms. He didn't need his name on a marquee. The more his name stayed off paper, the better. Bookmaking grew into an organized system because information moved faster. Racing wires delivered results to central offices, and central offices fed out of the way betting parlors. Adonis favored regulars like Frank Erickson, the country's best-known bookmaker, whose networks meshed with Costello's money and relationships. Prosecutors would later describe a city where cigar stores and social clubs functioned as retail counters for the larger syndicate. Clerks scribbled lines, phone men relayed odds, runners carried envelopes through afternoon crowds, and every route had a watcher to warn if the law walked in. The human map mattered as much as any ledger. Adonis kept the map updated. Politics threaded through it all. The city's machine still placed men in precinct houses and borough offices. New Jersey had its own county bosses who could bless or bury a case. Adonis paid attention to birthdays, funerals, election days, and charity dinners. He cultivated the habit of leaving without making a scene, shifting to a different entrance, or letting a driver collect a bill while he chatted with someone harmless in the lobby. Reporters sometimes trailed him out of habit and were rewarded with polite nods and no quotes. He was that rare figure who could be famous for saying nothing. The Luciano case in 1936 made silence even more valuable. Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey had built a record by taking apart vice rings and bookmakers. To the modernizers in the underworld, Dewey represented the worst kind of problem. Relentless, clean-cut, and good on radio. Allies tried every legal avenue to blunt the momentum appeals, bail arguments, motions to exclude testimony. Rumors swirled then and later that witnesses were pressured and jurors were approached. Courts investigated such claims with mixed results, and Adonis was never convicted of tampering. What did happen is clearer. Luciano lost, Costello inherited daily management, and Adonis became one of the men who ensured income continued, relationships were honored, and rash ideas were discouraged. After the war, with the waterfront humming and the city swelling, attention shifted again. Headlines from Havana in 1946 suggested a conclave of senior figures reviewing business and protocol. Accounts compiled by investigators and journalists later placed Adonis among those who visited Cuba during that period when Luciano, newly exiled, tried to influence affairs from offshore. The stories are a patchwork, but they align on a theme. He kept his seat at the main table without demanding the chair. Cuba came and went. The real work resumed in New York and New Jersey, where the gambling machine thrived. Union contacts shielded certain shops, and friendly landlords helped keep police at arm's length. Inevitably, a network that large generated friction. Some came from rivals, some from allies whose fortunes turned. Willie Moretti began to decline, a sad unraveling that everyone in those circles recognized as dangerous. He talked too freely, joked when he should have stayed quiet, and drew attention when invisibility was the daily assignment. In 1951, he was cut down in a Bergen County restaurant, a clean end that spared further embarrassment. No one issued a press release, but veterans understood what it meant. Leadership chose stability over sentiment. Adonis had been close to Moretti for years. The loss narrowed his circle and underlined the rule he had lived by since youth: never give anyone a reason to believe you'll talk. Public scrutiny reached a new pitch when Senator Estes K. Favre's committee turned organized crime into nightly television. The lights were hot, the microphones unforgiving, and the hearing rooms packed with citizens who had only read rumors before. Adonis arrived impeccably groomed and gave almost nothing away, invoking constitutional protections again and again. The committee couldn't compel a confession, but it could send a message to prosecutors around the country. The era of broadly tolerated rackets was ending. New Jersey authorities, eager to answer that mood, filed gambling cases that targeted the skeleton of his operation: bookmaking rooms, phone banks, and managers who kept books and code. Adonis fought some charges and yielded on others. He served a state prison term related to illegal gambling, a significant setback for a man who had spent decades minimizing exposure. On the day he walked out, he didn't regain the life he left. Immigration officers had a file ready. Because he had never become a citizen and had a record, they moved to push him out as an undesirable alien. Hearings unfolded over months, with lawyers arguing technical points, while newspapers ran photos of him smiling faintly at courthouse doors. Eventually, he took the route that gave him the most control over the optics. He agreed to leave. The government recorded a voluntary departure, but the effect matched deportation. He packed, said careful goodbyes, and boarded a ship, closing a long New York chapter with the same composed face he had shown to senators and mayors. What he left behind was both simple and sprawling. He had been central to the post-war gambling economy in Manhattan, and a cornerstone of the North Jersey rackets run in concert with Moretti and Zwillman. He had managed relationships with judges, police, and ward leaders so adroitly that for years he seemed immune to the fate that claimed noisier peers. He had played a role in the reorganization of the underworld after the Castellamarese chaos, pushed a business-first model, and enforced a culture that preferred schedules to shootouts. His personal style, careful, courteous, selective, became part of the legend. Columnists couldn't resist the nickname or the suits. Prosecutors couldn't prove half of what they suspected. That tension defined his fame. There were other threads too, the kind that color the margins of a life. He liked boxing and knew managers who placed fighters in big cards when the right friends made calls. He had acquaintances in the music business, a natural extension of his presence around nightclubs and Vegas rooms, and his New Jersey crowd brushed up against entertainers whose names still headline documentaries. Some tales about those years have hardened into lore that scholars handle with caution: stories about contracts loosened by pressure, stars steered into safer companies, favors traded backstage. What can be said without exaggeration is that Adonis's circle sat where entertainment, unions, and gambling met. And deals made in that intersection often looked exactly the same, whether one called them protection, investment, or extortion. Through all of it, he kept the habit that had carried him from Brooklyn tenements to the inner circle. He never let anyone see him hurry. He arrived on time, left early when necessary, and allowed underlings to play peacock while he counted. The law finally found a way to push him to the pier, but it never found a tape of him giving orders or a ledger with his full take. That absence wasn't an accident. It was strategy, polished over decades, the same strategy that had him choose a name that turned a mirror into armor. Italy greeted him with a polite stare and a thick file. He stepped off the ship looking like a man who had just changed hotels, not continents. Reporters watched for a slip, a sign of panic, but he gave them the same half-smile he used on waiters and ward leaders. The police wrote his name, noted his height and the crease in his trousers, and handed him a paper that spelled out his new routine. Report to the station on schedule. Stay put unless granted permission. Answer questions without raising your voice. He accepted it the way he accepted most things in life, by acting as if it had been his idea in the first place. Milan suited his taste. The city moved with speed and polish, and fashion houses filled windows with the kind of sharp lines he admired. He rented discreet apartments, stayed in good hotels when necessary, and let lawyers argue over the fine print of his status. The Italians called it special surveillance, a dry phrase that meant a man could walk the street but not move too far from a desk where someone stamped forms. He kept hours, signed registers, and limited travel. Rumors followed him to coffee bars and train platforms. Visiting Americans, some tourists, some businessmen, some old acquaintances, were said to pass through the lobby and leave with nothing more than a handshake. Whether they carried messages, memories, or just curiosity, he never explained. He let the stories do the talking. Every now and then he would head south to see an older friend from New York days who had also been pushed out. Two exiles taking a stroll along an Italian waterfront made good copy, and the sight of them together fed a belief, popular with both journalists and detectives, that the architecture created in America could be managed from abroad. Adonis did nothing to feed those headlines, and nothing to starve them. He kept a low voice, kept meetings short, and made sure the only trace left behind was the impression that good manners were his native language. Across the ocean, headlines were loud again. A rural town in upstate New York suddenly became famous when law enforcement stumbled upon a large gathering of underworld figures in 1957. The shockwaves rattled city halls and police departments nationwide. His name surfaced in the aftermath as pundits tried to measure influence. If the new order gathered in one place, what did that mean for the men who weren't there? Officials wondered whether exiles in Italy had given a blessing or sent advice. He didn't answer. By then, he had learned that silence weathered storms better than any speech. He wasn't at that meeting. He was living under watch, far from northern forests and New York driveways. Yet institutions built in the 1930 seconds still cast long shadows, and his reputation remained part of the outline. Italian authorities didn't romanticize him. To them, he was a foreigner with a history of organizing, betting, and nudging officials. They assigned plainclothes teams to watch his callers and checked his mail. A judge signed orders restricting his movement for stretches at a time. When he asked to change cities, they sometimes said yes, sometimes no, and sometimes moved him themselves. For a period, he lived on the Adriatic, a quieter coastline that felt very far from Broadway and Bergen County. He adjusted without protest. He kept the same routines: early barber, late lunch, evening walks on clean streets. If a newspaper man approached, he smiled, deflected with a line about enjoying the food, and kept moving. What he told people who asked about his finances was consistent. He said he was living on savings from years in America and modest investments. He didn't flaunt wealth. He wore good suits and paid his bills on time, but he avoided gestures that would spark a backlash. Investigators suspected that income still arrived from the United States, filtered through companies that supplied amusement devices or provided services to bars and restaurants. They suspected, too, that he knew men in Sicily and Naples who were tightening links between local clans and the American market. Proof was thin. The era didn't provide wiretaps and bank data the way later years would. He was careful, and caution looked a lot like innocence on paper. While he settled into the rhythms of exile, the balance in New York shifted. An attempt on Frank Costello's life in 1957 persuaded the old diplomat to step away from daily control. Another powerful figure fell later that year, leaving a vacancy that unleashed new ambitions. The climate changed. Ties that had anchored Adonis's world for 2 decades frayed. He remained a Costello loyalist, by temperament favoring deal-making over force, but he had no desire to become a voice from abroad in internal disputes. If anyone asked his opinion, he kept it short and bland. He had survived the 1930 seconds by learning when to let younger men believe ideas were theirs. He applied the same rule in his 60s. The list of schemes that defined his American career looked almost tame in exile, stripped of sirens and headlines. He had run bootlegging routes when liquor was outlawed, then parlayed those logistics into bookmaking rooms and slot machine networks. He had been accused of bribing a path around raids, steering union officials into partnerships that favored his friends, and taxing small-time operators who wanted peace. He had been hit with gambling indictments, faced televised inquiry, and served a state term before immigration rules shoved him across the Atlantic. Those facts were on the record. The rest, the whispered stories about influence over judges, the hints of pressure on witnesses, the speculation about long-distance control lived in footnotes and memoirs, the shadow material of a trade that prized plausible deniability. He built a remarkably ordinary daily life in Italy considering the notoriety. Neighbors saw a courteous man who tipped well and kept his shoes clean. He didn't hold court on park benches. He didn't champion causes or give interviews. He followed local soccer scores, read newspapers, and sent letters home. Family stayed in the United States, anchored in suburban routines that looked nothing like the tenements where he started. He called when he could, used careful language, and relied on intermediaries to handle anything that might echo to the wrong office. The distance hurt, but he neither begged for sympathy nor dared a return. The terms set by the government were firm. A step back onto American soil would trigger a quick escort the other way. From time to time, Italian police detained him briefly after a visitor left or a trip went longer than a permit allowed. The paperwork always told the same story. A man under special measures who had to be reminded of the rules. No major charges followed. He was too seasoned to hand prosecutors a gift. If authorities in Rome or Naples suspected that conversations held in hotel lounges had consequences in Newark or Manhattan, they could rarely trace a straight line. That was the point of his style since youth: stay polished, stay proximate to power, and let others handle the parts that made noise. The larger underworld evolved without him at its center. The heroin routes that would later draw intense scrutiny were just beginning to harden in the late 1950 seconds and early 1960 seconds, with Sicilian and French connections feeding demand in American cities. His name appeared occasionally in reports that tried to map the web between Italy and New York. Even those reports usually stopped short of direct accusations. They described meetings, friendships, and shared histories. He had no arrests for narcotics. He had enough trouble without adding a new front. Age softened his pace, but not his standards. Barbers still greeted him like a regular. Tailors still took pride in the fit. He never let go of the belief that presentation kept doors open, that money alone could not. He said little about the old years except to trusted friends, and even then he didn't dwell. Nostalgia was a luxury he rarely allowed. What mattered to him was the habit that had guided everything since he was a kid, counting coins at a corner stand. Keep appointments, keep confidence, and keep moving before attention hardens into danger. Yet even quiet lives collect echoes. Now and then a magazine in America would run a piece revisiting the glamour boy of the rackets and asking where he had gone. The answer was always the same. He was living under watch, still neat, still guarded. Still a reminder that the modern shape of American organized crime had been drawn by men who preferred rules to chaos. In that sense, his exile was not an erasure, but a footnote to a larger legacy. He had been there at the hinge points: the end of Prohibition, the reorganization after the old bosses fell, the post-war boom that turned gambling into a dependable machine. His strength had been counsel and consistency, not spectacle. Italy gave him a stage with no audience, and he accepted the part. He didn't pretend innocence. He insisted on boundaries. He would acknowledge gambling cases on the record and deny anything that suggested he ordered harm. That stance aligned with the image he had cultivated from the start. Not a saint, not a simple villain, but a businessman who believed in order. And believed, too, that order sometimes required pressure. It was a line he held through interrogations in New York and interviews in Milan, through long afternoons with a lawyer and short conversations with inspectors whose pens hovered over forms. Holding that line became the final discipline of a long career. By the early 1960 seconds, the name Adonis had faded from daily American papers, replaced by newer faces and new crises. In Italy, he was a familiar figure to the police, and a curiosity to some locals, nothing more. He had avoided the one fate he feared most: becoming a cautionary tale, splashed across front pages with lurid detail. Instead, he was a man out of place and time, living carefully, watching a world he helped shape continue without him. That, in its way, was the ending he had trained for, an ending without drama, maintained by poise, the quiet triumph of a man who learned, long ago, that the calmest voice often writes the longest story. Italy measured his days in ink. Each morning, a clerk at the Questura slid a register across a desk, and a neat signature confirmed where he slept and where he planned to be. The routine was meant to shrink his life to a set of lines on paper. He led it. A trim suit, a quiet greeting, a pen that never scratched the performance steadied him. Milan rewarded such poise. Tailors knew his preference for muted fabrics. Cafes learned not to hover. Hotel staff grew used to the same room requests and the same short stays. He kept his voice low, paid his bills, and left little trace beyond memory. Visitors appeared in cycles. A cousin from America came through with family photos and updates about children who had traded city blocks for suburbs. A businessman from New Jersey arrived to meet a textile supplier and asked if an old friend had time for a coffee. A bookmaker moved through Rome on his way to a racing meet in France and wondered aloud whether their mutual acquaintances still kept the same numbers in their address books. Conversations stayed light. If someone pressed for a favor, the answer came wrapped in courtesy. Try the usual channel. I'm not in that line anymore. It wasn't a lie so much as a boundary. For decades, he had built systems that protected him through distance. Exile turned distance into a permanent address. News from home acted like weather. Headlines warned of raids on phone rooms in Newark. A mayor in a Jersey city announced a cleanup that sent inspectors through taverns with flashlights and citation pads. Federal agents rolled up a wire service that had fed race results to betting shops. He read it all with the cool interest of a man who knew the architecture but no longer held the keys. Old allies adjusted better than some. Frank Erickson, the maestro of bookmaking, faced charges more than once but always found a way to keep the lines humming in some form. Others faded, retired, or ran out of luck. Nothing lasted forever, not even a well-tended circuit. The late 1950 seconds closed, with a jolt that confirmed what veterans already suspected. Troopers near a farmhouse in upstate New York stumbled on a large gathering and turned a driveway into a funnel of arrests. Names spilled into newspapers in a rush, many familiar, a few surprising. He wasn't present. Special oversight in Italy made such travel impossible. Still, pundits treated him as part of the long echo. If a council existed, then the men who midwifed it in the early 1930 seconds continued to be measured against it, even from afar. He let others debate significance. His habit of refusing to feed narratives had become muscle memory. Italian oversight tightened, then loosened, then tightened again. Orders set limits on where he could go and how long he could stay. At times, he lived under special surveillance in Milan. At other times, authorities shifted him south or to the Adriatic for stretches. The pattern reminded him of older practices he had read about as a young man, assignments that kept troublesome figures in small towns where gossip did more work than bars. He didn't complain. A barber in one city learned his exact taper. A cafe in another city kept a table open by the window. Familiarity replaced freedom. He valued control where he could find it in appointments kept, in a shoe shined properly, in a schedule that never made him hurry. From across the ocean came a different kind of exposure. In 1963, a low-ranking soldier named Joseph Valakai chose to cooperate with federal authorities. On television and in transcripts, Valakai explained structure, titles, rituals, and relationships. He spoke names that had previously lived only in whispers or in carefully couched newspaper columns. Among them, he placed Joe Adonis and the generation that remade the underworld after the old bosses fell. His description fit what insiders already knew. Adonis had been close to Luciano and Costello, had made fortunes from gambling and machines, had cultivated police and politicians without showiness, and had preferred a meeting to a melee. Valakai did not tie him to narcotics or to flamboyant acts. He painted him as an organizer who liked order and profit. It was not absolution, but it also wasn't the lurid portrait that fascinated magazine editors. For a man in exile, that balance mattered. He followed the Valakai hearings with professional curiosity. The government had finally found someone willing to turn internal vocabulary into public language. Terms like family, capo, and even Cosa Nostra migrated from conference rooms to living rooms. He recognized that a new era had arrived. With the story told out loud, prosecutors could frame cases differently. Juries could connect dots more easily. The modern structures he had helped encourage centralized decisions, revenue sharing, dispute resolution by counsel now lay bare. He thought back to the logic of the commission in 1931. It had been designed to prevent ruinous wars and stabilize the money. Stability required secrecy. Once secrecy went, stability followed. He didn't say that to anyone. He simply noted how quickly a shared vocabulary changed power. On paper, his record remained what the courts had recorded before he left. Bootlegging in the early years, illegal gambling and slot machine distributions, union influence around nightlife businesses, and bribery allegations that never quite made it to a decisive verdict. He had sat through Senate hearings, invoked his rights, and served a state sentence tied to betting. Immigration laws did the rest. From Italy, police kept him within the lines set by judges. He avoided trouble serious enough to produce new convictions. If he met visiting Americans with criminal records, he kept those encounters short and public enough to look harmless. Investigators noted arrivals and departures, filed reports full of adjectives suave, careful, discreet, and moved on to targets that offered better prospects for headline arrests. Money flowed quietly through old investments. He had stakes, often indirect, in vending companies, laundries, small trucking outfits, and restaurants that had served as reliable screens in New York and New Jersey. Some of those businesses survived his departure. Dividends made their way through channels set long before he boarded the ship. He lived comfortably, but not ostentatiously. The apartments were good, not palatial. The suits had clean lines, not gold trim. He always believed that the safest rich man looks middle class from a distance. People who had known him from the Broadway days sometimes pushed nostalgia on him. They remembered the bootlegging convoys that left Jersey depots at dusk, the club openings where chorus lines still sparkled even during a raid, the nights when ward leaders stopped by a table to whisper about votes and zoning. He let them talk. Every now and then he offered a line that sounded like advice. Keep your list short. Pay fast. Don't borrow trouble. Those rules had taken him from a Brooklyn tenement to the inside of a machine that printed money for years. They had also helped him leave that machine before it mangled him. Loss visited from time to time. Old friends died, some quietly, some with a headline. Longy Zwilman's death in 1959 prompted familiar arguments about cause, but the practical result for their shared sphere was the same. An era in Newark had ended. Frank Costello faded from the stage after the 1957 attempt on his life, maintaining a gentleman's profile until his own death years later. Luciano's passing in 1962, in Naples, closed a circle only men of their generation understood. Adonis received the news with the same calm face he brought to every event. He had sat near Luciano at moments that changed the shape of things. The world that followed carried their fingerprints. Respect didn't require speeches. Italian life granted him small pleasures he hadn't expected. He could walk without being stopped by a local columnist fishing for a quip. He could sit in a plaza and watch children chase a ball without a detective in a rumpled coat pretending to read a paper 10 feet away. There were still eyes, always. Surveillance in Italy was often quieter, sometimes almost courteous. A cop would nod as if they were neighbors. A magistrate would ask a question with a tone that sounded less like accusation than curiosity. He disliked being managed, yet he appreciated competence. Any system, even one that constrains you, feels tolerable if it follows its own rules. Gossip never stopped. Writers in America loved calling him Handsome Joe, a label born of his vanity during youth and a lifetime of careful grooming. They also loved attaching him to every famous person who had brushed up against the Jersey crowd around nightclubs. Most of those stories gave him more color than he deserved, and less credit for the one thing that really set him apart: discipline. He took care never to fuel a legend that could boomerang into a case file. His world had always paid premiums for discretion. He continued to collect them in the only currency left to him: time without handcuffs. Union entanglements from his New York years continued to echo in courtrooms without him. Prosecutors mapped schemes that used restaurant locals, service unions, or soft spots in distribution, chains to collect dues, push contracts, and steer deliveries. They found names tied to him by friendship or mentorship. Defense attorneys argued that in industries notorious for backroom arrangements, drawing straight lines to any man who did not sign a document on the record was a leap. The public, after years of televised hearings, grew more sophisticated about such shades of gray. Adonis watched from afar, satisfied that the culture he had preached, keep your head down, let intermediaries carry risk, remained embedded, even as law enforcement grew more aggressive. Aging brought humility without apology. He acknowledged to close friends that the state had finally boxed him cleverly. Instead of a sensational trial with photographs and a parade of witnesses, they had used immigration law, a quiet instrument that closed doors without drama. He admired the efficiency of it even as he mourned what it cost him. America had made him. Italy had taught him limits. Between the two, he had carved a life that, on a ledger, would show more wins than losses. He wrote letters often. Short notes to family carried the weather, compliments, and a question about school or a job. Longer letters to old associates stuck to safe topics: sports results, a restaurant's new chef, a marriage announcement. To a lawyer or two, he offered serious reflections on law, politics, and business, the kind of measured thinking that had made him a valued counselor since the Castellamarese years. He never dictated, he suggested. The difference had protected him in New York, and protected him now. Every so often, police in Italy invited him to the station for clarification about a visitor or a trip. He sat in a chair, answered politely, and left the room feeling the old balance. Give them something without giving them anything. A lifetime of steering conversations around potholes had made that second nature. If the questions touched on gambling or old allies, He reminded them he had paid for those chapters in court and in prison. If they asked about new faces from overseas, he smiled and said tourists love Italy, and so did old men with memories. A quiet tally of his life would mark 4 pillars. He helped the Young Turks push a business model into a land ruled by feuds. He turned prohibition logistics into post-prohibition gambling that created steady income in 2 states. He built a practice of smoothing officials and minimizing spectacle, using envelopes and calendars instead of threats and headlines. He accepted a forced farewell when the law finally found the lever he could not counter. In exile, he followed the rules, preserved dignity, and watched new players fight over a house he had helped design. Some nights, looking out at a street that glowed under a soft Italian evening, he allowed memory to stretch. The clink of a glass in Manhattan. The hum of a packed room in Jersey where men traded 5s and 10s over a counter. The way a phone runner's eyes scanned a doorway for a badge and then relaxed when a familiar sergeant walked by with a wink. Those scenes had taught him the value of rhythm. Hold a city to a rhythm, and you hold profit. He once held that rhythm with grace. Now others did. He took that as proof, not loss. Systems survive men. The best a man can do is leave a system that remains legible after he's gone. In that, he believed, he had succeeded enough to be at peace. Age did not dim his instinct for schedules. Even in places where he was only a guest by government permission, he kept an eye on timetables, trains that arrived with trustworthy regularity, cafes that opened their doors at the same minute each morning, clerks who stamped forms without drama. Order had been his life's lever. He found comfort in watching it play out in small, lawful ways that no prosecutor could interrupt. A quiet routine took shape, an unhurried shave, a walk past shop windows that mirrored a familiar silhouette, a late breakfast where the staff learned that he preferred conversation no louder than the clink of a spoon. Visitors kept the past alive without dragging him back into it. A lawyer from New York brought updates on appeals filed by men whose names once filled his address book. A restaurateur from Jersey City, now retired, visited his daughter in Europe and asked if the old gentleman would share a coffee. A tailor from Naples mentioned that he addressed more than one American who spoke of him with respect, then chose not to share those comments in detail. Courtesy structured every encounter. If someone hinted at business, he smiled and gestured toward the door, as if to say that the world moved along fine without his hand on the wheel. Italy's oversight could feel like a tide, sometimes in, sometimes out, always present. For stretches, he was placed under special supervision that limited travel and required in-person check-ins. Officials viewed him as what the paperwork called a man of bad living, not in the moral sense, but as a persistent organizer of illicit commerce. He understood their intent. In New York, he had long ago learned that the bluntest justice was often the quietest. The tax summons that replaced a raid, the licensing board that tightened a screw instead of sending a task force. Italy had its version. Rather than stage a noisy trial bound to tangle in jurisdictional problems, they kept him visible and predictable. Across the Atlantic, a different show played out. Committees in Washington and Albany examined links between labor, gambling, and municipal power. The McClellan hearings on union corruption, with a young Robert Kennedy on staff, turned names into headlines and transformed vague suspicions into structured narratives. While his name did not dominate those sessions, the template described there the pressure on locals tied to trucking, linen supply, and bartenders' councils looked familiar. In the 1,930 seconds and 1,940 seconds, he had backed precisely those leverage points. Delivery schedules could be interrupted. Contracts needed signatures. Permits could be delayed. A gentle nudge in the right place earned a reliable percentage without shattered glass. He had not invented the method, but he had used it elegantly. Journalists kept returning to the older chapters. They revisited the LaGuardia crusade that sent slot machines tumbling into the river and recounted how the devices migrated to New Jersey counters under friendlier sheriffs. They described a gambling map that traced from Times Square cigar stands to phone rooms in Newark, and they tried to assign a fraction of every dollar to him. He rarely corrected them. What he had done was no longer secret. Prohibition had given him his start. Bootlegging routes had paid for his first decent suits. After repeal, he moved into bookmaking and devices. Those nickel and dime machines that, multiplied across hundreds of storefronts, became a river. He cultivated municipal contacts not with threats, but with favors and timing. He had been charged in more than one gambling case and had served a state sentence before immigration law pushed him out. Those were the facts he allowed to sit on the table. Everything else whispered claims about witness pressure, stories about jurors approached in stairwells, tales that put him on the edge of every major decision remained foggy enough that even ambitious prosecutors hesitated to build on them. Deportation, or what the file called voluntary departure under a cloud, had not erased his reputation at home. Police still drew lines between old crews and new bosses, and his name appeared as a reference point, the way a surveyor's stake shows where a property once began. In Newark, after Longis Wilman's death, the fabric he had helped weave unraveled into looser threads. In Manhattan, as Costello receded, other hands grasped for prominence. He read about it all, clipping an article once in a while and folding it into a book as a makeshift bookmark. Those crumbs of paper were not keepsakes so much as reminders. The structure works until it doesn't, then something else takes its place. His health held steady into his 60s. He watched his diet, walked daily, and kept to a sleep schedule that had survived hotel life, prison routines, and police oversight. Old injuries that he never discussed stiffened in damp weather, but vanity kept his posture straight. He liked good shoes, and he liked them shined. Vanity, in fact, had always been part of his toolkit. The nickname that trailed him from youth, Adonis, started as a joke and ended as armor. People underestimated men who looked too polished for trouble, and he had spent a career proving that a silk tie could hide a ledger. Contacts from the entertainment world, more rumor than record, bubbled up now and then in letters and phone calls. He knew band leaders from the era when club owners needed nightly deliveries of cash and liquor, and he knew booking agents who placed comics and crooners in rooms that answered to friends in Jersey. Stories spread over the years about contracts loosened under pressure, or opportunities suddenly available after a visit from a man with a smile and a firm handshake. Many such stories grew taller with retelling. He neither endorsed nor denied them. What is safe to say is that Adonis and his New Jersey allies moved in spheres where entertainment, unions, and gambling overlapped, and deals in that intersection tended to favor the man who could promise calm. The narcotics traffic that pulled law enforcement into new battles in the 1,960 seconds never adhered to his fingerprints. Detectives rummaging through reports tried to plot lines from him to Sicilian brokers and French suppliers, but no file produced the kind of evidence that had become possible in later decades. His history sat squarely in vice of a different sort. Alcohol when it was banned, wagers when they were outlawed, games of chance that hid in back rooms. He had always preferred commerce that could be understood as a service rather than a threat. Drugs were neither predictable nor acceptable to the patrons he used to cultivate judges who liked a quiet drink, ward leaders who liked a friendly room, businessmen who wanted a safe bet on a Saturday. He had enough to answer for without inviting a messier war. Family mattered to him more as time passed. Calls traveled across the ocean at set hours. Photographs arrived in envelopes with neat captions on the back. He tracked birthdays and anniversaries, sent gifts that were tasteful but not flashy, and made sure that letters contained cheer, not complaint. In private, the separation weighed on him, but he treated it as he treated every other constraint since youth. Walk the line, keep the voice soft, and let no one see you resent the rules. He had chosen poise long ago, and found that it aged better than bravado. During occasional interviews granted to Italian reporters, short, controlled, and always on neutral ground, he came across as a man who believed in business and had paid for mistakes. He acknowledged having been convicted of illegal gambling in the United States and having been forced to leave. Asked about his friendship with well-known figures, he leaned on polite phrases. An acquaintance from years ago, a man I knew in business, someone I respect. He would not give a headline to anyone. That caution annoyed young journalists raised on the spectacle of televised hearings, but a few older writers appreciated the consistency. His restraint, they understood, was not a trick of the moment. It was the foundation of his survival. Italian magistrates remained wary. From time to time, they issued orders shifting him to new districts, or reaffirming that any trip must be prepaid in paperwork. He met those conditions without visible irritation. The point of those orders was not only to monitor him but to limit the magnetism he still held for visitors from North America. A man like him created a kind of gravity, pulling old loyalties into orbit. The state preferred that his orbit stay small, He adjusted. Even reduced to quiet neighborhoods and familiar cafes, he retained a sense of stagecraft, the measured entrance, the unruffled coat, the exit just before anyone could turn a conversation sideways. In reflective moods, he thought back to the mechanics of the 1,930 seconds that seldom made it into courtroom transcripts. Alcohol shipments moved because paperwork matched license plates and bribes, synchronized with patrol patterns. Bookmaking worked because runners knew how to read a room and knew the difference between a customer and an informant. Payoffs weren't random. They ran on schedules. He had once trained younger men to treat calendars as tools, holidays that softened enforcement. Elections that made a certain precinct nervous, budget cycles that changed a department's appetite for raids. That functional knowledge explained his success better than any myth about charisma. He also knew that he had benefited from a historical moment. Immigration had poured talent and desperation into tight places where ambition sharpened quickly. A national ban on liquor handed a willing generation a business plan. A city that tolerated vice, so long as it did not explode under the mayor's nose, supplied cover. When all those conditions shifted, prohibition ended, cameras arrived in hearing rooms, immigration rules turned into a lever his margin narrowed. He had adjusted right up to the edge and then accepted exile rather than risk a spectacle. Even now, in another country, he recognized the same arc in younger figures who mistook temporary advantage for permanent immunity. The people who had sat closest to him in New York had mostly left the stage. Some died quietly in their homes, others died noisily in places that guaranteed a headline. A few found themselves on witness stands. He judged none of them publicly. Privately, he noted patterns. Those who chased headlines got them. Those who kept lists short-lasted. He had been lucky too. Luck, in his mind, favored men who didn't ask it to work too hard. In later years, doctors began to appear in his schedule with the same regularity once reserved for tailors and lawyers. A dull ache here, shortness of breath there, nothing dramatic, just the normal wear accumulated by a life of late nights and steady tension. He followed instructions, took his pills, and trimmed the already modest indulgences further. The man who had learned to say no to every dangerous request now learned to say no to a second espresso. From time to time, he read biographies and sensational paperbacks that folded his name into the sweep of the American underworld. He recognized certain facts, shrugged at embellishments, and smiled at mistakes that only someone who had lived it would spot at once. The big picture was usually right. He had been a builder of order in an industry that preferred frenzy, a keeper of peace when peace meant profits. He had run illegal enterprises, bribed officials, and taxed those who wanted to operate under his umbrella. He had faced the government and lost when it used tools he could not deflect. Those truths, he believed, were enough for the record. Travel within Italy, when allowed, brought small pleasures. A view of the Ligurian Sea from a promenade where no one knew his name. A Sunday lunch in Emilia, where the owner treated him like an uncle. A brief stay in a hill town where the air felt different from the damp plains he had grown used to. He never stayed long. The point was not to disappear, but to live without strain. Estrangement from America remained absolute. Lawyers occasionally looked for a way to loosen the ban. Nothing came of it. By the late 1,960 seconds, his life had narrowed to essentials. He was a man with a famous past moving discreetly through a quiet present. He had avoided attention long enough that younger officers in the Italian services knew him only as a file they inherited, a figure from another country's drama whom they checked on out of duty. He took that as a final compliment. In his world, being forgettable had always been the ultimate skill. Now, in a place where the best-known faces were singers and footballers rather than ward bosses and bookmakers, he had achieved an invisibility that no makeup could produce, a fading not of character but of consequence. Years earlier, someone had called him the mirror at the edge of the bar. He thought of that line sometimes. Mirrors do not sing or shout. They frame the action and make rooms look larger than they are. He had been that and enlarger, a man who gave a shape to other men's ambitions and collected a percentage for the service. Even far from the stages where he once worked, he could see the outlines clearly. New fires burn, new hands draw schedules, new faces learn the old lesson that even the neatest ledger can become evidence. He left such thoughts to the night and woke each morning ready to honor the modest commitments that remained, keep the luble Appointment at the station, walk the boulevard, write a letter, take the air. The grand era had passed, but the craft of living carefully still held. In the late 1960 seconds, he moved through Italy like a man walking along a shoreline at low tide, careful with each step, reading the ripples, never in a hurry. Paperwork framed his life. Permits allowed trips within certain provinces, officers logged his visits to the station, and any overnight stay in a new city needed a stamp before it began. He accepted the ritual with the same quiet discipline that had kept him afloat since youth. No raised voice, no sudden gestures, nothing that would make a clerk decide to complicate his day. From across the Atlantic, the cast kept changing. After the shock of that rural raid years earlier, leadership reshuffled again and again. Carlo Gambino's patient rise, Vito Genovese's push and later imprisonment, the turbulence around Joe Bonanno's attempted consolidation in the mid-1960 seconds. Each chapter reached him in clipped summaries, folded into newspapers, or in cautious phone calls late at night. He traced the outlines without inserting himself. The old method he had helped promote meetings, votes, compromise, still existed but faced new pressure. Younger men courted headlines in a way his generation avoided, and prosecutors used those headlines to stitch cases together. Television and congressional hearings had turned once private language into common knowledge. After Joseph Valakai explained structure and ranks in 1963, federal lawyers began thinking in charts. Conspiracy theory in court gained sharper edges, and multi-defendant cases grew more ambitious. When he read about a new statute proposed in Washington, eventually signed in 1970, that allowed prosecutors to treat ongoing criminal enterprises as a single target rather than isolated incidents, he knew the world had shifted. In his era, insulation came from compartmentalizing routines. The clerk who took wagers didn't know the man who financed the phones. The landlord who rented the room didn't know the man who settled disputes. A law aimed at patterns rather than singular acts would have bitten deeper, sooner. He had built his career in vice that neighbors tolerated until it got loud. Liquor during the dry years, bets when racing ruled the sports pages, slot machines that ate nickels behind candy counters. Those ventures offered a certain logic. A regular placed a small wager, or pulled a handle during lunch. A policeman looked the other way because the street stayed quiet, and his captain liked reliable nights. The narcotics trade did not fit that pattern. It drew attention, bred chaos, and invited penalties that left no room for negotiation. Reports in the 1960 seconds tried to tie every veteran with a New York pedigree to drug supply lines building across the Atlantic. His file stayed thin on that subject. He stuck to the same public line for the rest of his life. Gambling had paid him, machines had paid him, influence and envelopes had kept schedules intact. He wanted no part of products that ruptured order. Italy itself was changing fast. The post-war boom raised cranes over cities that had been quiet when he first arrived. New highways cut travel times. Factories drew workers from villages. Cafes filled with students reading newspapers that treated crime and culture with the same brisk curiosity. He adjusted easily to modern storefronts and clean train platforms. Routine gave him comfort, and booming cities run on timetables. A barber's chair at 10, a late morning espresso at a table by the window, a slow walk under arcades as shopkeepers rolled up doors. The choreography could have been Manhattan without the sirens. He kept a small circle. A lawyer from New York would pass through Milan and suggest lunch in a crowded place, where every conversation dissolved into ambient sound. A distant relative would visit and talk about mortgages, school fees, and the cost of a used car, swapping a slice of ordinary life for the old street talk he had long ago set aside. If someone steered a conversation toward business, he leaned on a phrase that ended as many requests as it softened. "I'm finished with that kind of work." The message held. Visitors left with courtesies, not instructions. Italian oversight had its own rhythm. For months at a time, restrictions would ease. Then a new directive would arrive from a magistrate requiring more frequent check-ins or a temporary move to another province. He made those adjustments without visible annoyance. The point, he knew, was to keep him predictable and to prevent the gravitational pull that a man with his address book could still exert on travelers from North America. Police often treated him with a kind of formal politeness, the acknowledgement one professional gives another. He respected the efficiency. It mirrored what he used to value in a precinct house, that knew how to balance the letter of the rule with the pace of a city. Old colleagues in the United States continued to face heat. Frank Erickson's name resurfaced whenever bookmakers took heavy losses in a raid. Union figures in restaurant and service trades found themselves in hearings where staff lawyers asked crisp questions about deliveries, dues, and contracts. He recognized the pattern. In the 1,930 seconds and 1,940 seconds, he had favored exactly those pressure points. A truck delayed, a permit expedited, a contract nudged into place. It was the art of adjusting friction rather than lighting fires. He had been accused of paying off inspectors, steering union leaders, and taxing those who worked under his umbrella. He had been convicted in state court for illegal gambling, then forced out of the country when immigration officials pulled the lever that required the least drama. None of that changed in hindsight. If anything, distance made the art clearer. He kept his American finances modest on paper and legal in tone. Dividends from older investments reached him through channels set up years earlier, stakes in vending outfits, laundries, trucks tied to restaurants, small real estate notes. Those streams were not flashy, but consistency had always been his goal. He believed that the safest wealth looks routine from a distance. Tailors noticed he never wore jewelry beyond a watch. Hotel staff saw bills paid promptly. Noise was for other people. By then, he had outlived the men whose names had once filled entire gossip columns. Luciano had died in Naples in 1962, a passing that closed the book on the man who had reorganized the American underworld with corporate logic. Frank Costello's retirement from frontline management had been followed by a long coda marked by dinners, quiet counsel, and then his own death in the 1,970 seconds. Newark's kingpin Longis Willman was gone, his end a magnet for speculation. Willie Moretti, the brash foil to Adonis's calm, had been erased years before when his illness and loosened tongue threatened stability. Each death chipped away at the world. Adonis knew best. He did not romanticize it. Institutions he had helped shape survived because they answered a demand. They would evolve without him, for better or worse. His health began to register the years. Doctors urged lighter meals, fewer cigars, steady walks. He complied with the same neat diligence he gave to appointments at the police station. A man who had survived on balance understood that the body is also a ledger. You pay what you take. On damp mornings, he felt the ache of old tension in his shoulders. On hot afternoons, he cut the walk short and sat in shade. Vanity kept him well turned out, but pride took quieter forms now, keeping weight steady, keeping temper even, keeping sleep regular. Writers continued to chase the glamour narrative: handsome suits, nightclub tables, whispered friendships with entertainers whose careers intersected with New Jersey backers. He rarely gave them anything to use. The parts of that legend grounded in fact were already public. He had invested in restaurants and lounges, had known promoters and booking agents, had orbited a Jersey crew that liked bright rooms and famous faces. The parts that belonged in fiction stayed there. He had no interest in clarifying stories that made good copy and bad history. When the French Connection cases broke into headlines, pushing heroin supply lines into the center of public debate, he read with detachment. The machinery of international smuggling, the use of ports, the chain of ports, couriers and brokers, it all looked like a logistical puzzle that would have tempted lesser men to imagine they could manage it as cleanly as a bookmaking network. He thought the risk calculus was different by an order of magnitude. One arrest could unravel an entire chain. One overdose could turn public tolerance into fury. He had once taught younger earners to avoid trades that made neighbors fearful. That rule would have kept him out of narcotics, even if temptation had knocked. Family news mattered most. Weddings, births, graduations, they filtered into his days through letters and carefully placed calls. He responded with warmth and practical help, choosing gifts that didn't invite questions from officials who read mail. Pride lived in small rituals, marking birthdays on a pocket calendar, memorizing school subjects, celebrating a new job. He wanted the next generation to live far from the rooms where his money had been made. Distance, in that sense, was a blessing. At times, he allowed himself to analyze the old craft with the clinical tone of a retired engineer. Bootlegging had taught him route planning and risk pricing. Machine distribution had taught him inventory and maintenance. Bookmaking had taught him information flows and cash management. Union leverage had taught him how to move a city with 2 phone calls and a handshake. Those skills, he believed, were neutral tools. valuable in any industry. Crime had been the classroom available to an immigrant boy with nerve and limited options. He never asked for absolution, only for accuracy. He had broken the law, profited, protected himself with distance, and left when the law found a lever he could not pry loose. As 1970 turned, he felt history catching up in a different way. New legislation in the United States empowered federal prosecutors to treat long-running organizations as living organisms and to attach penalties that reached assets decades old. He suspected that had such laws existed when he was in his prime, the envelope of the weak strategy would not have sufficed. Younger men still in the game were about to learn that the state had rewritten the rulebook. He was content to watch the lesson unfold from a continent away. In the final stretch of that decade, he kept his world narrow and tidy. Days were measured by walks, books, newspapers, and the occasional visitor who brought him a little noise from across the ocean. Nights passed without clubs or cards, only a radio tuned low. He remained courteous with police, firm with anyone who hinted at restarting old engines, and consistent in the image he had polished for half a century. A man who favored order over drama, schedules over theatrics, profit over pride. Health nudged him toward even quieter habits, and he accepted the nudge. He had lived by the discipline of restraint. Age only strengthened it. Legal files in Italy still listed him as a monitored figure with a history of organizing unlawful trade abroad. He complied with renewals of supervision orders, answered predictable questions about visitors, and avoided any travel that might suggest evasion. The discipline looked simple from the outside. It took more effort than most imagined. To keep a life smooth under that much watchfulness required the same craft that once kept an empire of rooms and numbers invisible to patrolmen on their evening rounds. He sometimes walked beside the sea when permission allowed a trip to the coast. The water was a clean line that neither argued nor explained itself. That suited him. Wind off the Adriatic cooled the ache in his chest. No one there knew his full past. A man with good shoes and better manners could be anybody on a promenade where families ate gelato and teenagers debated football. He would sit for a while, stand slowly, and return to the city that knew his name at the station but rarely on the street. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the city that made him kept moving at its own speed. He had chosen his distance and maintained it. The next turn would come, as always, in quiet. By 1970, he had become the quiet figure in a corner cafe who read every page of the paper and missed nothing. A new American law filled columns with analysis and charts. Prosecutors now had a tool that treated a continuing enterprise as a single target, connecting years of routine into one case. He understood the implication at once. His old method slicing responsibility into thin layers, keeping clerks away from financiers, letting landlords claim ignorance would have held less protection under that statute. The government had learned to think like a bookkeeper. He nodded at the lesson and folded the page. Italy moved on around him with brisk confidence. Construction cranes swung above boulevards, trains ran on time, and students debated politics in doorways. He liked the order, the way shopkeepers opened shutters at the same moment each morning. Even the visits to the police station had a rhythm that soothed him. A clerk placed a ledger on the counter. He signed, exchanged 2 polite sentences, and left. The men who watched him did their jobs without malice. He respected skill wherever he saw it. The circle of friends had grown small but steady. A cousin arrived with photographs of a graduation. A lawyer from New York brought careful stories that didn't require names, the kind that carried meaning between lines. A former maitre d' from a midtown room wrote that he had retired to Florida and still told guests about nights when judges and comics shared the same booth. He answered every letter with warmth and a certain restraint, keeping the past in focus without inviting the present to imitate it. Doctors began to appear more often in his calendar. He followed advice, lightened meals, trimmed walks on hot afternoons, and treated rest as part of discipline rather than a concession to age. Vanity persisted in useful ways. His shoes stayed shined, ties matched jackets with quiet precision. He had once used polish as camouflage. Now it stuck, because habit is a kind of spine. Reporters checked in from time to time, especially when an old name resurfaced in a fresh trial. They asked about the early bootlegging days, about the nightclubs that hid betting rooms behind friendly counters, about the envelopes that bought calm. He offered facts that were already public. As a young man, he had made money in auto theft rings and liquor during the dry years. After repeal, He embraced bookmaking and slot machines. He backed a system that paid for punctuality and punished chaos. He cultivated public officials by schedule and courtesy, not tantrum. He had been charged more than once for gambling and served a state term. Immigration law shoved him out. He denied involvement in narcotics every time anyone raised it. Then he closed the door before a follow-up question turned a memory into a headline. The old guard had thinned to obituaries. Luciano's passing in Naples had come years earlier. Costello lived long enough to become a portrait of the gentleman broker, then slipped away. Newark's anchor was gone. The loud men had burned bright and vanished. The planners either retired or fell under cases shaped by new statutes and wire rooms that recorded what whispers used to hide. He read those stories without relish. Competition and the law had turned the city into a different game. He had helped design the earlier one and felt no need to grade the new players. He found quiet joy in little rituals. A neighborhood barber who understood exactly how to taper the side so the part sat right. A coffee poured just as he walked in, placed on a saucer without a question. A promenade along the Adriatic when permission allowed, wind in his face. The shore a clean line that asked nothing. Children ran past him without a glance. No one on the seawall knew a thing about a tenement boy who had learned to turn charm into a lever and schedules into protection. When he looked back, he translated the old craft into simple terms. Logistics, not legend, had carried him. Trucks that rolled on time, couriers who kept their heads. A precinct map that showed which routes stayed quiet during elections or holidays. A union that could slow deliveries with a phone call. Quiet agreements that spared the city from sudden shocks. He had broken laws, yes, and profited. He had bribed officials, coordinated gambling, controlled machines that ate coins all day, taken a cut from operators who asked for cover. He had been careful to keep distance from room to room so that his name almost never sat on a lease or a payroll. That system hid him well enough for decades. Then the government found a law that bypassed discretion and used status itself as proof. He could admire the craft even when it worked against him. Late in 1971, aches that he had managed for years pressed harder. He kept appointments anyway. Pride would not let him miss a check-in or cancel a lunch because of discomfort. One morning, after signing the register at the station in a port city on the Adriatic, he felt a tightness he could not walk off. Police called a doctor. Italian papers later reported that he was taken to a hospital in Ancona and did not leave it alive. The man who had practiced poise for a lifetime died in a country that had known him only as a file, a face, and a set of rules to be followed. News crossed the ocean fast. American headlines dusted off familiar phrases: handsome Joe, Luciano ally, deported racketeer, and sketched his arc in neat strokes. There were nods to the early years, to the reorganization after the Castellamarese conflict, to the gambling networks that ran from Midtown to North Jersey, to the televised hearings where he answered nothing and everything at once with a polite refusal. Some obituaries tried to tie him to every myth that had grown around his name. Others kept to the record. He had always preferred the second version. Even in death, restraint suited him. Family handled arrangements quietly. There were no crowds at a church door. No cameras waiting for a quote. Friends who had not seen him in years sent notes with old nicknames and a few lines about suits, manners, and the feeling of safety he gave to rooms where money moved. A few men who had learned their craft under his eye raised a glass in private and repeated lessons out loud so they would not be lost. Keep lists short, pay fast, avoid noise. His legacy lived in structure more than in stories. He had pushed a business model into a world that had been ruled by feuds. He had favored coordination over grudge, calendars over fury, meetings over sudden moves. The commission created in the early 1932, a council built to settle disputes and protect profit, carried his generation's fingerprints. The gambling economy that knit Manhattan to Newark owed much to his patience for logistics and his talent for soft power. The ease with which he worked a restaurant entrance, a precinct house, a courthouse hallway, those were the moves that made money without headlines. If he had a philosophy, it was simple. Order earns. He also left a caution. No matter how smooth the suit, the file grows. He had avoided trials that turned into public theater, yet the state found a quiet route that ended his American life without a dramatic scene. Immigration law did what juries had not. Once abroad, he lived under watch that never slept. In the end, his days were peaceful but prescribed. a measured walk inside lines drawn by others. Even a master of discretion answers to time and to the state's patience. People still argue about the details: who did what in a Coney Island restaurant, who carried which message to Havana, who made which phone call in a crisis. He never did the history's work for anyone. He left gaps that scholars would fill with context, and that storytellers would fill with color. What stands on firm ground is clear enough. He rose from a crowded immigrant world to stand beside the men who modernized organized crime in America. He made most of his money in gambling and devices, buttressed by political relationships and union influence. He avoided the drug trade. He faced charges for gambling, spent time in custody, and left the United States under pressure. He died in Italy, still neat, still measured. If a passerby in his last neighborhood had asked what mattered to him, he might have answered with a list that sounds hardly criminal at all. Keep your word, be on time, know the room, leave before trouble starts. Those rules had been tools in a world that did not forgive error. They were also advice he passed to younger relatives who would never set foot in a back room. He hoped they would put those tools to better use than he had. After he was gone, the story did not end. It shifted rooms. What had been a life measured by appointments and envelopes became a stack of files, a clutch of taped hearings, and a handful of photographs that captured suits, smiles, and the glint off a hair tonic bottle. Archivists tagged boxes with his legal name and his chosen one, Giuseppe Antonio Dotto and Joe Adonis, and future readers learned how a nickname born as a tease became a calling card that opened doors. Detectives who had tailed him wrote reports that read like stage directions. Enters at 9, nods at host, sits with back to wall, leaves before dessert. Prosecutors summarized his decades in bullet points. Reporters reshaped those points into prose. Between the two, a pattern emerged that even his critics respected. He had turned crime into schedule. What lingers in the public record is plain enough to trace. He grew from a boy selling errands on New York corners into a young man who made money with his hands and his head in the disorder after the First World War. He stole cars and rings that supplied bootleg convoys, then traded that risk for the higher yield of liquor distribution when the country went dry. He helped midwife a new style in the underworld, less about tribal feuds, more about coordination alongside peers who would become pillars of a national order. Luciano, Lansky, Siegel, Costello, Anastasia. During the upheaval at the dawn of the 1,930 seconds, accounts place him among the architects who favored an end to random killings and a beginning of rules. He backed the council approach that let strong men split markets rather than shred them. When Prohibition died, he pivoted to gambling with almost clinical efficiency. Horsebooks, numbers, phone rooms, and a lattice of slot machines that migrated from Manhattan to North Jersey when a mayor decided to make a spectacle of municipal backbone. He also shaped the gray space between police and politicians, learning which precinct captains valued predictability and which borough fixers could calm a fire before it singed the papers. He paid, and he paid on time. He rarely threatened. His leverage was steadiness. A sergeant who knew a back room would stay quiet had fewer reasons to grandstand. Labor influence followed the same script. In trades that touched nightlife linen, soda, jukebox routes, small trucking, bartenders locals, he turned delays into instruments. A permit that appeared on a precise date, a delivery that resumed after a handshake, a contract that stopped wobbling after an introduction. Each outcome created a dependency, and dependencies paid percentages. By the late 1,930 seconds, he was an organizer of vice rather than a street enforcer. A man who stood slightly off stage while the lights fell on rooms he financed. The accusations came as a consequence of scale. City and state prosecutors tied his name to bribery schemes, illegal machine distribution, and the coordination of betting across county lines. Federal investigators put him in the orbit of men who managed enforcement for the broader syndicate, yet he kept distance from day-to-day violence so effectively that his file had more innuendo than evidence on that score. He was charged and convicted on state gambling counts in New Jersey, served time, and crucially found the federal government waiting with immigration papers on release. He had never naturalized. The lever nobody could pry loose pressed down, and he agreed to leave rather than ignite a fight he could not win. In Italy, he lived under special surveillance that restricted movement and required check-ins. He kept his composure as if the rules were of his own making. He died there, far from the restaurants where he had learned to glide. The crimes tied to his name, stated plainly and without romance, fill a ledger that law students could study. He stole cars, moved liquor during Prohibition, ran and protected illegal gambling, distributed machines where they were not allowed, corrupted public officials with payments, leveraged unions to steer contracts and deliveries, laundered profits through front businesses, and taxed smaller operators who wanted peace. He aided allies who preferred profit to feuds and lent weight to decisions that consolidated power under a council designed to end ruinous wars. He faced a televised Senate inquiry and invoked the privilege that the Constitution allows the accused. He did time for gambling offenses and left the country when immigration law marked him as unwelcome. On the record, he denied involvement in narcotics, and unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not acquire a narcotics arrest on either side of the ocean. Plenty of color grew around that skeleton over the years. Writers embellished meetings in Havana, squeezed him into every famous booth in Midtown, and put him at more critical conversations than one man could have attended. The more careful accounts strike a quieter note. He was not a don in the classic throne room sense. He was a fixer, an investor, a bridge between boroughs and between New York and North Jersey. He walked the line between charisma and calculation with unusual discipline. Allies valued his ability to make a room calm down without raising a voice. Competitors respected the fact that he showed up with a watch and a calendar instead of a parade. A few myths are worth clearing before the files gather more dust. Confusion with other names has always plagued stories told at a distance. He was not Joseph Massino, who ran the Bonanno family decades after Adonis's prime and in a very different era. He was not Joe Bonanno, the boss whose autobiography added fuel to myth-making. He was the Brooklyn-bred Giuseppe Dotto, who turned himself into Joe Adonis, close to Luciano and Costello, grounded in gambling and municipal influence. Accounts that place him at every famous killing flat in history. Historians list him as a planner and ally within the Luciano camp during the 1931 transitions, sometimes as a participant in setups, rarely with reliable proof as a triggerman. That ambiguity mirrors his method. He preferred to be present at decisions, absent from crime scenes. His deportation years invite a quieter kind of interpretation. Under Italian special surveillance, he signed registers, accepted travel limits, and learned how to keep a life within narrow lanes. He met visitors in public places, held conversations that left no actionable residue, and lived off savings and investments that had been routed through ordinary businesses long before his ship sailed. Police in Milan, Naples, or Ancona treated him with a formal distance that he returned. He remained a symbol, a reminder of an American era when vicemen dressed like bankers and turned city routines into cash machines. In that sense, Italy saw not a predator but a professional in exile, so practiced at composure that few locals recognized the reach his name still held in older newspapers. Law enforcement's own evolution can be measured against his career. In the 1,930 seconds, targets were rooms and raids. In the 1,950 seconds, televised hearings tried to turn secrecy into spectacle. By 1970, statutes like the Enterprise Law, that later became famous under an acronym, allowed prosecutors to treat habits as evidence and structures as co-conspirators. Had those tools existed at his peak, the strategy of compartmentalizing risk would have failed earlier. His story thus marks a hinge in the timeline, a gifted organizer operating at the edge of the state's capacity who eventually met a bureaucracy that learned to think like him. What remains difficult to capture in reports is the sensibility that guided his choices. He had faith in routine. He treated bribes as recurring obligations rather than as emergencies, and he expected the same from those who worked under his umbrella. He found leverage in common civility. A greeting remembered, a favor returned on a named date, a bill settled exactly. He believed that violence was a receipt nobody wanted to sign unless forced. That preference did not make him gentle. It made him effective in an economy that punished the loud. He turned the machinery of a city, its timetables, its offices, its appetite for entertainment, into a companion. For years, the city paid him back. The quieter corners of his personal life feel like cutscenes. He married, raised children who grew up as Americans, and stayed there when he was pushed out. And he kept family out of the rooms where money was counted. He liked sport. particularly boxing when managers and promoters could still be leaned on with a suggestion and a ticket. He enjoyed restaurants where attention cost nothing and privacy was priceless. Vanity clung to him until the end. He never surrendered the habit of a perfect part and a suit that sat right across the shoulders. The nickname that had started as a joke hardened into identity. Cameras went looking for Handsome Joe, and he obliged them with a look, not lines. After his death, his circle shrank to reminiscence and footnote. Former associates passed along lessons he had repeated for decades, stripped of bravado and rich with caution. Keep lists short. Pay fast. Don't borrow trouble. They rang like proverbs outside the world in which he coined them. Business schools might phrase them differently. His version fitted the tenement boys' curriculum. Historians placed him in the first rank of the modernizers who, with Luciano at the center, replaced familial vendetta with something closer to a corporate chart. Scholars who dislike romance about crime still credit him with helping to lock the market to a steadier rhythm. The city he left behind has changed so much that the map of his old routes reads like folklore. The piers that once swung with cargo and gossip now hold parks and glass towers. Nightclubs where he took tables turned into offices and then into condos. Phone rooms became relics the moment wires yielded to satellites. Yet the logic he applied about how information moves, how schedules govern profit, how small favors paid on time build influence, travels well into any age. It is not an endorsement to note this. It is simply a recognition that craft, even in illegal trades, has a shape. He understood that shape perfectly and wrote it as long as law and luck allowed. He belongs finally to an American story about ambition. A boy from Avellino province reached New York in a wave of migrants who filled blocks where languages collided and opportunities hid in alleyways. He found mentors and rivals, learned rules that were not written down, and attached himself to men who wanted to pull their world out of feuds and into something reliable. He prospered. He broke laws. He was charged, sometimes beat the case, sometimes lost, and ultimately faced a system that found a quiet way to end his run. In exile, he kept his dignity and lived as he had always lived, by routine, by restraint, by the conviction that the loudest man in the room is seldom the most powerful. If his ghost lingers anywhere, it is in the image of a polished shoe at the threshold of a back room, pausing long enough for the host to look up and nod. He was the pause the breath a city takes when it agrees to be managed. That gift made him rich, and then made him famous enough to be removed. In the arithmetic of his life, the sum is not hard to show. He helped design a system that replaced chaos with process. He extracted money from that system using illegal means that courts named and punished. He left when the law found a lever he could not counter, and died under watch in a foreign city that treated him with cool professionalism. Between those points runs a line as straight as the crease in his trousers. It is not a moral, it is a map. People still argue over pieces of that map. Some want him more ruthless, some more innocent. The record gives enough to resist both impulses. He was disciplined, calculating, and ambitious, and he favored quiet over theater. He organized gambling and devices on a wide scale, greased officials to keep business smooth, and stood near the center when the modern American underworld took its shape. He avoided the narcotics trade that later ruined many of his peers. He went to prison for gambling in a state case, not a federal one, and accepted removal rather than a drawn-out battle he could not win. He died as neatly as he had lived, of a failing heart, after one last signed register on a coastal morning. If there is a lesson in that end, it may be this. In a world that tempts men to chase glamour, the strongest currency is still control. He practiced it like a craftsperson, and for a long time it paid. Then the state learned to match the craft and time, which never takes a bribe, collected what was owed,